Welcome to the Happy in the Mess podcast. We are your hosts, Marlena, Sherry, and Matthew. We are therapists and coaches, and we want to share our own stories with you, as well as the wisdom, insights, and tips we've learned along the way. Thanks for tuning in to this episode.
Hello, all. Welcome back to Happy in the Mess. This is episode 22. So glad you're here. We are discussing grieving the loss of what never was or what never will be. It's kind of an ambiguous grief. It's about grieving the loss of dreams. Just as a reminder, please like, share, subscribe, rate, and review. And we'd love to hear from you. We are three therapists and also coaches. So this is a really high quality podcast. And if you want to work with each of us, please remind us where we can find each of you. Sherry, you are the relationship coach. Where can they find you?
Yeah, I'm a couples relationship coach. I help married couples stay connected, break out of roommate syndrome. They can find probably the best way to find me is in my Facebook group. It's the date night community, and it has resources for married couples so that they can have a deeply connected relationship. And I am launching the latest cohort of the married dating program that I have. It's Date Your Way Back to Desire. And so if you're interested in that, wanting to know more about that, you can just reach out to me or find me in my group.
Awesome. Thank you, Sherry. And Matthew is our Misfit Refuge coach. Tell us about you, Matthew.
Yep, I am at matthewemorgan.com or Misfit Refuge on social media, and I work with folks in the neurodivergent community, particularly those struggling with faith, spirituality issues. That has been the latest flow of things, and we're just kind of rolling with that and seeing what we find there.
Excellent. And just as a reminder to everyone listening out there, just again, the credentialing and the quality and the training of these coaches. This is not, your typical coach, because they both have master's degrees and have had many years of experience as therapists as they transition to coaching. So you're receiving something much, much better than you would typically. And I'm Coach Marlena at coachmarlena.com. And you can, I'm a singles expert, the mental fitness for singles. So, and all the things that they have to navigate. And now onto our topic.
Well, Marlena, you are
Yes.
just as trained as we are. You mentioned us,
Yes.
but you are also a highly trained therapist coach as well.
Yes, yes. Thank you for pointing that out. Yes, yes. I also have the master's degree and the years of training as a therapist and a coach. So we stumbled upon this topic because we realized that we too have experienced grief in our own lives regarding things that never happened that we wished would have. And it's kind of an ambiguous grief, like I said before. So let's get started with what does this mean? What does this ambiguous grief look like? What does it mean to grieve the loss of something that never really was?
Yeah, I think there's a tangible grief that we are most familiar with. I mean, you watch any show, and if somebody passes away, like it's like, okay, this is obvious. We lay a body to rest. We have these rituals that we go through, and that becomes very easy. And in a breakup, the person is there, and then they're not there. That part is, and when I say easy, I just mean straightforward. It's not. It's at no point is grief really an easy thing to go through. But I think here we're also dealing with this idea of the intangible loss. It was one of the things I reflected on when my mom passed away, was that we had sometimes we grieve the things that were, sometimes we grieve the things that never were, and sometimes we grieve the things that never will be. And it's that depth, I think, that we're living in here, and just kind of fleshing out that nuance of intangible grief.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to channel my inner Matthew here for a moment. My children have gotten me very into the graphic novel world. And as a result, I've seen a lot of movies and shows. And there's this concept of the multiverse, I think, really kind of brings this intangible home. There is an episode on Flash where one of the other characters realizes that he went back in time and changed things. And because of that, I think he had a daughter and he now had a son. And that character was so angry because he had taken something away from him. And it was something that he never even experienced but his understanding of having lost something that he never in his mind he could understand that he never actually had that. And so even though at even though he never really had that son or daughter, whatever that was that he didn't have, like it was that knowing that his life could have gone very different, or maybe even should have gone very different. And so this idea of the multiverse, really where like every decision can split off into different potential life paths, and that sometimes we have in our mind this life path that seems like the one we're supposed to be on. But then it doesn't happen that way. But we still grieve the fact that we thought that that was the way our life was going to go. And so, whether that's decisions about the future, decisions about the past, whether that's a life we didn't think we'd get, or if we thought that was a relationship that would be different than it really actually is, like just that loss or that wishing or that thinking that things didn't work out the way that you thought that they should.
Mhm. Wow, this gets into such deep philosophical, like what do we actually have control over? What do we not? How responsible are we for the loss of a particular dream that didn't materialize? Or, this is a very, very kind of complicated subject. I'm curious if either of you want to weigh in on the responsibility part and how can we tease apart what's really ours to have changed and what is kind of needing acceptance.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sherry, thank you. You're speaking my love language here, and I know exactly what you're talking about. That arc with like Flash is a great way of doing that. There's several episodes where they really just kind of rip your heart out of these things,
Yeah, I'm
and
sure I didn't do it justice the way you would have.
oh no, you did
That
just
was really
fine with him.
impactful on me.
Yes, that whole arc, yeah, near and dear, and it puts us in this idea. Sci-fi is a fantastic way to process through some of this stuff. Marlena, you were talking about responsibility. There's this responsibility nature in sci-fi of like, oh, let's go back and change the timeline, but we don't realize the effect that that's going to have. And if we carry that through into the real world, we don't have. I'm assuming nobody has the capacity for time travel yet. It'll be interesting to see if we do. Um,
Isn't that evidence that we don't, because nobody has come back from the
because we haven't
future to change
exactly.
things?
Yeah, that they just looked at 2020 and like, just don't go back there. Like that, and the 3 years around it is just a no-fly zone. Like don't touch. Anyway, but no, it like we can't do that. So that responsibility comes to sometimes I call this the Lego process. And I grew up in the old school Lego days where you had the big bucket of Lego and you turned it upside down on the shag carpeting, which was not a great idea, because then you create landmines for the future. But you dump it out and you see what's there. And I think when you're trying to look for responsibility, part of what we do is if we're working with a counselor or a coach, our own journaling, our own thoughts, lay that out there and just be mindful. I'm going to channel my inner Marlena here. I think we're just all switching bodies here. Like to be mindful of our emotions, be mindful of what comes up as we're looking at these pieces, and just really weighing it out. I use the DBT REST acronym quite frequently. And they say relax for R. I always say regulate, right? Regulate, evaluate, set the intention, take action. Regulate to me is a lot nicer, but you regulate yourself and you look at these pieces and you're like, okay, was this something that was handed to me? Was this something that was constructed? Was this something that I expected to be there? And all of a sudden there's a blank spot, like when you're digging around and like, I know there's a piece in here, there should be a piece in here, but there's not a piece that fits this, and I think our lives can be that way because everything feels very responsible. It feels very self-responsible. Or sometimes it can feel other responsible. And it's really important to determine, did I have control over this? Did I not have control over this?
Grief
It's
is
an important to distinguish.
Grief is such a tricky topic anyways. When someone dies, there's this idea of how long you should grieve. And it's based on this formula of how society or culture evaluates how close that relationship was and how much you really lost. And that equation doesn't often match up with what a person feels inside about grief. So we have a really hard time with the loss of someone. So when you talk about these intangible things, you're talking about loss of things that never were. And so often there's very little support for that. And that loss comes from all sorts of other places. When I was graduating from college from my bachelor's, I imagined that I was going to go on and get my PhD. And through a series of events, I did not. And I remember I got a job because I was so certain in that interview that I was going to get my PhD that years later, that supervisor told me that that really stuck out for her, that I was going to get a PhD. So flash forward 20 plus years, and I, of course, for lots of reasons, had decided I was not going to get a PhD. And then there became an opportunity that made sense to get it. And so this thing that has been like tucked in the back of my mind and was something that I imagined for myself and had some grief around not getting, then finally comes around. But I mean, you could really say that I had grieved that for 20 plus years because that's what I thought was going to happen. And that's what happens with these intangibles is they can kind of weigh on you. They can be in the back of your mind. They can be something that then colors your future decisions. And in this case, it will end up being like the fulfillment of that loss. And so it'll be a joyous thing for me. But often there, and I can probably point to lots of other situations where it didn't come full circle and it didn't come to fulfillment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I want to circle back around to a beginning part that we didn't really go over, but Sherry, you're touching on, which is what are the kinds of things, what are these ambiguous things that we grieve? You know, it sounds like for you, a life path that felt very certain at the time. It did come to fruition, or it's coming to fruition now, a timeline much later. But like, what about these other things? Like, how else does this grief show up? What kinds of things have y'all noticed, either with yourselves or with clients? How do we identify it?
The big one that I see a lot is grief for a relationship that will never be the way we want it to be, particularly a relationship with a parent or a child. Now, there's lots of other relationships that don't turn out the way we want them to, but those two seem to be big themes that I see a lot.
What about you, Matthew?
Or spouse. I should say, or spouse. You know, my couples, this is a huge theme. I need to throw that in.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, when we expect our, somebody to be the, the cover of the latest romance novel, and we end up, being the negative. It's like, what do we do with this? The and I'm with Sherry on this. I think the parental relationship and the child relationship is a big one. It's a foundational aspect for all of us, whether it's good or bad. It really sets the tone for really how the baton is handed off between generations. And we've had past generations that have, either thrown the baton or dropped it along the way, and we've had to either go back and pick it up or, deal with the damage that was there. Sounds like this might be a good follow-up episode to lead into on this. So we grieve that. One of the things that shows up for me is the first thing I was thinking. I my son, when he was getting old enough, we built a loft bed for him to sleep in. I have a bad tendency to over-engineer things. So not only did I build a loft bed, but I built a loft bed with rope lights underneath it, LED lights. There's a desk in there. There's all the safety features to make sure he doesn't fall out. There's, a headboard that's lighted. And I showed it to my brother, and my brother's like, you know what? When your parents can't give you good things, then you turn around and you do that for your kids. I was like, ooh, like that was a little deeper than I expected. I was just trying to build a bed out of this, but I think there's that sense of the intangible loss, and I love my dad did a phenomenal job given what everything that he went through. But we went through a very tumultuous time. And so I turn around, I'm like, hey, I want to give my kiddo a relatively stable time as much as, a teenager can have stability. But it's only through that loss and that recognition of that intangible stuff that we can grow through this process.
Mm.
Sometimes we don't give credence to loss of things. And I think that's sometimes easier to see in our kids. Um, I had a child who would get very, very attached to her shoes. And she would outgrow them and she'd be like cramming her feet into them. And I knew that they would hurt, but giving up that pair of shoes just felt physically painful to her. And of course, this is a child's view. And as adults, we'd be like, well, of course, just give up those shoes. You have something better here. But there's also that part of us that really craves that security and that comfort and that familiarity. And when that is stripped away, even for something better, there's that hole, that missing piece of what we had with that old thing.
Mm. That's a really great metaphor for this.
Mhm.
And I will say too, with the people I work with, parent relationships that they wish parent was more emotionally available or supportive or what have you than they are, and probably will not be. And it's an ongoing struggle to accept that. And because the person's still living, there's this kind of almost hope that this will be better, that somehow, and I see this with singles too, who have yet to meet someone that really fulfills a partnership role that they were hoping for, and this ongoing loneliness. And it's kind of like, how do you grieve and have hope at the same time? I mean, of course, we can hold those things together. Like, the story's not yet done. And how do you accept where you are and not feeling desperate and grasping? And so, how do you deal with, some grief? Just like for you, Sherry, the PhD, you set it aside and yet here it came later. But sometimes it's not healthy to hold on to the hope that it will rematerialize or come. So it's very complicated. How do you allow yourself to grieve? And perhaps that's the healthy thing to do. And how do you still hold on to some hope? Because maybe it might materialize, or the relationship could change. It's complicated.
It's
Any
complicated. I think that
Yeah.
sums the whole topic up here.
Yeah. And so going back to the control piece, like, how do you know when you've done everything you can do to help affect change or do the thing you want, and how do you just accept and just say, okay, this door is slamming in my face and I cannot proceed. When do we accept that? I have a hard time accepting that. I usually will try all solutions that I can think of before I accept defeat. And is really accepting defeat, or is it just going over to the winning side? Be like, you know what? I'm going to have more peace if I just surrender to this the way it is. Any thoughts on that? When is it time to accept where you are?
So I'm going to add to your question rather than adding clarity. Each of us have been therapists for a long time and then also stepped into a coaching role of a new business with all new, like everything new about it, the marketing and the business structure and the relationships, and having to decide whether this is a path that's working and to continue pursuing it versus is this something that is not really the path that's opening easily before us. And I know that each one of us have really wrestled with doing something new and how long you continue doing something new before you decide, is this the right new thing or am I supposed to be on a different path?
Mm.
And I don't have a clear answer to that because it's complicated and it's murky and mucky, and there isn't much support for the loss of that kind of a dream
Mm-hmm.
when it isn't easy or it doesn't maybe even doesn't come true.
Mm-hmm.
There was a very wise prophet once who wrote that you got to know when to hold them and know when to fold them. know when to walk away, know when to run. Okay, it might have been Kenny Rogers too. It's funny. My mom enters the conversation again. She used to clean the house to that on Saturdays. That record. But that's essentially what we're talking about here, right? When do we hold on and try to push through? And sometimes it's a bluff. Sometimes it's we don't know what we're doing. Making this transition. Like there's new stuff here. And then sometimes you can have a great hand and somebody just has something better. There's a lot of metaphors, I think, with the card here. But ultimately, there's not a clear-cut answer on that. I mean, I think even the most seasoned players would say, some of it's instinctual, some of it's looking for, are there other opportunities? Sometimes it's a matter of like, let me lay down before this gets to be too costly. And, even if the victory is costly, we have to think about that. And it can feel like grief, especially if we're trying to push through and win. So I think maybe the one of the X factors here might even be just a sense of faith, or that idea of if this is meant to be, it's going to come back at a better time. Nothing. In the grand sum of the universe, I am not that significant of a number. So if it's important, it may come back to us, and maybe something we can revisit. Sherry, I appreciate your mentioning of the doctorate. That has been a dream of mine ever since I saw the theological red stripes on the robes, and I decided I wanted a Darth Vader mask and a doctorate. Probably not the best decision-making paradigm to use, right? But I think a lot of times, either these will come back in one form or another, if we're mindful, if we're looking for it. I think paying attention to our emotional state may be the other thing too. Is if we find ourselves in constant rage mode, constant fight or flight, dysregulated. There may be a good sign that we're not pushing into an area that we're supposed to be quite yet.
Or even constant denial, which is, the stages of grief. I mean, is what you're talking about, like rage and bargaining, denial, and sadness. I really appreciate your Lego metaphor. Like, what are we working with here, or what are we not, or what's missing? Sherry?
So Matthew, what I heard you say is I've got to learn everyone else's tell so I know when to play and when to bluff. And there may not have been the right message there.
May not be.
What I also heard you say is that when our actions are guided by our faith and our values, that is something that helps us know whether we're on the right path and we should keep pursuing something versus say this wasn't really the path that was meant for me.
I had a professor that I really admired when I was going through divinity school who used to say, the deepest desires of your heart are placed there by God and therefore are good and, presumably attainable. And sometimes I wonder if part of having the faith is reimagining perhaps what that might look like. It may not look the way I thought it was going to look, but I can still have that. I think about, people who felt reparented by other people in their life other than their own parents, who've experienced that nurturing coming from a different source, or that relationship of love coming from a friend rather than maybe a romantic partner. Like they were able to receive the things they always wanted. It just showed up in a different form. As a way, not as a workaround per se, but as a way like, the desire was met. It just came in this, a different presentation. And I agree. So this kind of goes into this. How do we comfort ourselves when we're experiencing this kind of grief? How do we comfort others?
There's really only one thing that heals grief, and that's time. As much as I would love to have the tips or the tricks, I think making sure that we're talking about it, making sure that we're finding support. You can pass the time with finding, find hobbies, find things that you can that aren't necessarily distractions, but may hold that spot for a little bit. So wherever your support comes from, grab it. Don't forget your self-care. right? And all of this, if we're losing our self-care, we're not taking care of the basic premise. And it doesn't have to be fancy. We don't need to cook fettuccine Alfredo every single night. Sometimes just a nutrition bar or something really basic may be all we can do. So do that. Drink your water, get your rest, allow yourself that space to grieve, and time will bring it through.
So all of that, I love the story of, I once met a woman and she was in grief and she refinished all the floors in her house. I met someone who built a deck, and that was their expression of grief, was to find something and kind of take that feeling and convert it into something else. So I think that's an often overlooked way of grieving, and other people don't necessarily understand when you get into that project that is that converting. The thing that I would add to what Matthew said is I think we need to let people define grief for themselves. Like, I might have been disappointed that I didn't get the PhD, and it would be easy for other people to look at me and say, but you don't actually need the PhD. What's that going to add to your life? Or that's just something that you didn't get. So what? But I think that we do need to let other people define what it is that they feel like they lost out on so that they can define that path for themselves.
I think you're speaking to a really important point, acknowledging and validating your own feelings. If you feel sad about something, it's legitimate. End of story. And you can be sad about it and talking to people who are going to validate that sadness. I mean, and not necessarily stay there and then engage in like a pity party per se, but like allowing yourself to have your feelings around whatever it is that didn't happen, or the relationship you wish would have looked a different way, or the relationship that never was. All of that's very legitimate. And I think very healing for ourselves is to self-soothe when we are experiencing that and not pretend that, well, I shouldn't feel this way, and that's just making it so much worse.
Yeah.
The other side of hope, there's the hope of hoping that that thing will work out the way we want it to. But the other side of hope is that something good will come from this loss, and that maybe we can't see what that is, but that there is a gift and an opportunity in that loss that we can't see while we're processing it and in the middle of it.
Sowing in ashes. We allow that, the passing dreams to become new ones, and transform them into something different. I think
absolutely. Go ahead, Matthew.
It's that what you were saying, Marlena, we'll use the phrase a lot of times of a first world problem, and we do that to minimize, many times we do that to minimize our grief, or minimize others' grief. And that's one of those expressions I'm very, very cautious about using and receiving. Marlene or Cherry, you mentioned your daughter's shoes earlier. If we forget what it's like to be a kid and go through our loss of our shoes or our blanket or our, a friendship that the first breakup, the first time a boy breaks your daughter's heart, and you're like, whatever, like there's going to be other, no, like that's the worst pain imaginable for that person. That's the worst thing they've gone through. So even though somebody may always have it worse or different, I think going back to that, let's just acknowledge what it is, and it is a loss and it is a hurt.
And it's all relative, like you said, with kids, or even as adults, we do this. We cling to something that we really wanted, and it's really sad when we don't get it. And it makes us more relatable, because grief is a common human experience and emotion. And so there is some value just to going through the experience itself. It makes us, more relatable to others, and we can understand other people's pain more. That empathy that's so important to human relationships is cultivated when we go through grief.
I think about my daughter's shoes, and as an adult, we would say, that's trivial and that doesn't matter. But then I also think of couples where they compromise themselves again and again and again in service of a relationship. And if there's not that reciprocity and that like moving forward and growth in the relationship, that you can get to the point where you are grieving things as trivial as a pair of shoes. And if you just blow past that, then you miss the learning that comes with understanding why that pair of shoes was really, really important and how that affects future decisions. But also not just ignoring those little losses, but also seeing them as opportunities to learn something about yourself.
Mm-hmm. Acknowledging the loss means acknowledging that space and that emptiness and being able to tolerate it. It's so hard. I mean, yes, I love the question, what is the gift and opportunity in this grief and this loss? However, if I don't acknowledge how painful it was and leave room for the space and the emptiness that creates, I might miss out on the gift and the opportunity. Quite honestly, if I try to rush and fill it in with something that's going to make me feel maybe better immediately, drugs, alcohol, porn, whatever the thing is to like fill the void, I'll miss out perhaps on what could be there. How could that space be more filled with something healthier for me, or a new relationship, or whatever it is, a new dream. Yeah. The ways we cope. That's another episode that y'all can find in the previous season, I believe. So is there any benefit just to keeping dreams a dream, and allowing perhaps that space and just not ever accomplishing the dream? I'm just curious. What do y'all think? Do some things just exist better as a dream rather than a reality?
North, it's a concept that we use, and we measure everything by it. Our compasses point north, and so we know which direction we're headed there. The majority of us never reach north unless we are particularly explorative in our nature. Not my high desire right now, especially having unseasonably cold weather. But sometimes that dream, even if the dream is not attainable or tangible, sometimes the principles of it are. And holding on to it, I don't, as long as it does not put us into a point where we're, making poor choices for ourselves or our loved ones. If we can hold it maybe in that sense of emotional balance, it's not a problem to keep it. I still periodically have dreams of being an astronaut at 47 and not in the prime shape of my life. Probably not going to happen. But it's still a fun dream to deal with.
Maybe when space travel becomes a regular everyday thing for people.
I'll be a space counselor happily.
I guess what I'm thinking of is what happens when you accomplish everything on your bucket list. What happens when you have finished personal growth? And I think that there is a value in continuing to strive and having the idea that you're never going to accomplish all of your dreams, and that those dreams are still valuable because they're part of what makes you curious. It's part of what makes you step outside of your comfort zone and do something that you haven't done before. But obviously not letting that take over. If you finish your bucket list, you can start a new bucket list. So it doesn't mean that is done and finished. It may mean that you're moving on to the next thing.
I love that. It's such a hopeful note for us to end on, that sometimes the dreams can remain as fun fantasies or the continual pursuit of new things in life, and discovering new opportunities, new relationships, new places to go, etc., new experiences to have. And any parting thoughts that you'd like to leave our audience with today around this topic of grieving dreams?
Just be gentle with yourself. Acknowledge what the grief is and be gentle with yourself. Don't judge yourself for missing something or wishing something were different. Let that be part of the big picture or the tapestry that makes your life richer, by knowing that there are paths that you haven't been on or that you could be on or that you wish you were on, and that's all part of the human experience.
Yeah.
Let's say, remember that you are a human being, not a human doing. You are not what you do. You are who you are, and hold on to that. Hold on to the character. Hold on to the intangibles, the dreams that are there. and
Mhm.
recognize that if it doesn't, it's not you personally. If these things didn't happen, it affects you, but it wasn't something you did. So you're still awesome the way you are.
I love that. And I just say, for those of you listening who've experienced this kind of grief, which is likely, we all probably will at some point, you're not alone. It's a normal human experience. And sometimes that I guess that loss or that rejection in a sense it could be an opportunity for redirection. Um, and with that, remember to like, share, subscribe, rate, and review. Let us know what you'd like us to talk about. We've got a lot of experience and expertise here. And thank you so much for listening today.